Hello and welcome to another episode of Prime Rogue Inc.'s Rogue Insight. My name is Kevin Duskett. Please drop us a subscribe, follow, like, leave a comment. Today, we are talking the gray zone in modern warfare. What is it? This is a question that came to us from a viewer, so we're going to talk about it. The gray zone is basically this liminal space, this space that doesn't exist between peace and war, but that really does exist, where states or non-state actors engage in activities that are below the threshold for traditional war, but which still seek to use coercion to achieve political or military objectives. Now, if we look at the spectrum closer to war, we have actual war, we have proxy war, information war. If we look at peace, we have the daily status quo, diplomatic negotiations. But in the middle, we have this gray zone, right? Ecological warfare, Israeli surgical airstrikes against non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah, psy warfare, fake news, propaganda, legal war, political war. These tactics that we're going to get into that deliberately blur the line between war and peace to make it difficult for adversaries to respond without escalating, which are things that China and Russia, for example, have grown to be experts into. These often use non-military means. They often involve covert operations that are low profile or deniable, and this makes it really hard to attribute them directly to an actor involved. Let's get into some examples of gray zone tactics. Cyber attacks are one. These are often used to disrupt critical infrastructure, elections, or governmental systems. Take a look at, for example, Russia's involvement in attempting to influence the 2016 election in the United States. We have disinformation campaigns to destabilize public trust or influence electoral outcomes. So again, Russia's use of social media to disrupt political discourse across the Western democracies is a very well-documented case of this. We have economic coercion, so unofficial sanctions or restrictions of trade to pressure a country without directly engaging in military conflict. China does this regularly. Take a look at its restrictions against Australia in response to their political disagreements and Australia's increasingly close relationship with the United States. So what are these strategic goals that are associated with these gray zone operations? One, avoiding military escalation by staying below the threshold of war. Two, gaining a political advantage, because that you can destabilize the rival country, weaken their alliances, or create internal divisions to maybe attack them later without engaging in overt aggression. So let's look at some historical examples of this. And one is the Crimean annexation by Russia in 2014. It's a textbook example of gray zone tactics. Moscow deployed quote-unquote little green men. They were Russian soldiers without insignia to destabilize the region before annexing it. Basically creating this narrative that Crimea wanted to join Russia. So the combination of covert operations with the disinformation campaign, where unmarked troops combined with Russian state media and online actors spreading narratives that justified the annexation to protect ethnic Russians, was a relatively powerful tool that fell short of outright war. We can also look at election interference in the 2016 U.S. elections. We had disinformation campaigns, we had hacking of email servers, targeted misinformation campaigns to manipulate public opinion, etc. China is also really good at this. It uses maritime militias that are made up of civilian fishing fleet vessels, ostensibly, to basically assert its claims in the South China Sea. These are non-military vessels, but they're engaged in quasi-military activity like ramming the ships of the Filipino Coast Guard. So because China's using civilian vessels, it can avoid direct naval engagements, but still push other territorial claimants out of these contested waters. You can also see this in its artificial island building. These are basically attempts to extend China's territorial control without really provoking an outright military response. So they have the potential to allow China long-term to dominate crucial sea lanes. Let's go over to Iran. By supporting Hezbollah and other militias, these proxies, through funding, arms, training. These can advance Iranian interests without Iran directly becoming involved in a war. And Iran can, with very little credibility, but nonetheless, claim that it is not directly responsible for what is going on. It's also engaged in critical infrastructure cyber attacks, like the 2012 attack on Saudi Aramco that crippled 30,000 computers. Dramatically hurt Saudi Arabia's basically only industry because it's failed to economically diversify. You should read a book about the oil curse if you want to know more about that. But you also go to North Korea, the Lazarus Group, which was its state-sponsored hacking group, involved in significant cyber heists for crypto, etc., ransomware attacks that fund the regime, destabilize global financial systems, etc. So you look back to the 2017 WannaCry ransomware attack, hit 150 countries. North Korea was insulated from direct military repercussions because it could maintain plausible deniability. So the gray zone is extensively used, and not just by bad guys. The U.S. uses gray zone geopolitics as well. And if we're just going to look at a few examples, we could have narrative wars where they're labeling China as a revisionist nation and pushing, a narrative within the Chinese press. Civilian interventions of various types by using influential actors to attempt to distort domestic Chinese perceptions. Quote unquote free operations in international waters, which are these freedom of navigation operations, which are not actually, truly benign, and just maintaining a forward presence, for example, in Southeast Asia. These are all ways by which the U.S. does very similar things, and we give it a pass, but it's involved in the same type of activity. Every superpower, global power, regional power is involved in the gray zone right now, because the gray zone is this liminal space, this blurred line between war and peace. And these operations consistently, deliberately fall below the threshold for open conflict. So it makes it difficult for global institutions to effectively respond to them. From the UN to NATO, other international bodies, they are structured based on international law around traditional concepts of war and peace, so they can't really deal with ambiguous tactics. Just look at Russia's use of hybrid warfare in Crimea. It was a legal gray area. And even if Ukraine had been a member of NATO, it's not clear if Article 5 would have been clearly triggered by that. And this kind of posed a challenge to traditional deterrence because, tactics like cyber attacks, economic coercion, or disinformation don't provoke clear-cut military responses. That would be seen as overly aggressive. So U.S. cyber defense strategies are reactive because it's difficult to retaliate against a cyber attack from in the gray zone without clear attribution, like we saw in the SolarWinds hacks. But this is contributing significantly to some dynamics in the international system. One of these is the erosion of U.S. dominance. As the U.S. and its allies face new challenges from China, Russia, and other states that use these gray zone tactics to incrementally expand their influence, the fact that they're not triggering direct military intervention means they can continue growing in power without a meaningful U.S. response. They can also grow reputationally as revisionist powers. China, Russia, Iran, they're all using these gray zone tactics to challenge the status quo. Russia with hybrid warfare, China territorial claims, Iran via its proxies and militias, and not getting a meaningful response, unless you're talking about Israel bombing the living hell out of Hezbollah and Hamas. But one of the most significant challenges in gray zone operation is cyber warfare, which is growing in significance and growing in seriousness as AI evolves. Cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns are very hard to attribute, especially when they're carried out through proxies or third-party actors. And this is something that makes it very difficult to counter gray zone tactics, except by engaging in gray zone tactics of your own. And this points to the fact that our current international legal framework is lagging behind the evolution of the gray zone and of warfare, because there are very well-established laws governing conventional warfare, but legal frameworks surrounding cyber attacks, economic coercion, and disinformation are far less developed. There isn't even an international consensus on what is an act of war in cyberspace. So as that continues to occur, the continued use of gray zone tactics is going to destabilize the international liberal order. It's going to make democracies especially vulnerable, notably in relation to disinformation and election interference, because they are so open to the outside. So gray zone conflicts are kind of redefining modern warfare, or at least the shaping operations that are used to get there, by changing the traditional rules of engagement and by making traditional responses somewhat irrelevant. If we look at how countries are currently responding to gray zone threats, we're seeing a lot of hybrid defense strategies where countries are developing strategies combining conventional military capabilities with non-military tools like cybersecurity, intelligence, and various economic measures, because gray zone activities do involve a full spectrum of threats. If we take a look at NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's hybrid warfare strategy, notably because of its engagements with Russia, it's strengthened its cyber defenses, improved its intelligence sharing between member states, and basically just continued to increase cooperation in areas that Russia could hit, like energy and infrastructure. So, taking an example, NATO established the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, the CCD-COE, in Estonia, as kind of a signal to Russia that, hey, we can hit back if you launch a cyber attack against us. There's also integrated deterrence, which the U.S. is shifting towards, which basically combines military readiness, diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and cyber defense to deter these activities in the gray zone. And these were very clearly emphasized in the 2022 U.S. National Security Strategy in relation to the need for a whole-of-government approach that would deter adversaries within the gray zone through a combination of military power, economic sanctions, cyber capacities, and diplomatic action. There's also cyber defense initiatives that are emerging more significantly, creating specialized units within the military and intelligence agencies that are dedicated to detecting these attacks before they occur and from protecting critical infrastructure and responding to cyber threats. We could look at United States Cyber Command, the U.S. military's U.S. Cybercom, and it's playing an increasingly important role in national defense because it is tasked with detecting and countering cyber attacks by state actors. And the U.S. has itself engaged in offensive cyber operations, many of them not attributed in recent years, to basically disrupt potential foreign threats before they could materialize. The EU also has a cybersecurity strategy. It's not as developed as the United States because there's less defense integration there, but it's premised on improving resilience against cyber attacks, especially those are oriented towards elections, financial systems, and critical infrastructure. And it's definitely a work in progress. But stuff like private-public partnerships are really important because the private sector tends to control critical infrastructure throughout much of the democratic world. So the U.S. and other governments are increasingly engaging in these public-private partnerships to ensure that they're capable of protecting this critical infrastructure. So the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, partners with private companies to secure their financial, energy, and telecommunications sectors against gray zone threats. Disinformation, though, is still a big deal. It seems like since COVID, people will believe anything, right? So public awareness campaigns are also a critical element of countering gray zone stuff. The EU has created an action plan against disinformation, which basically is seeking to improve media literacy amongst its citizens, enhance fact-checking capabilities, and enhance transparency in relation to online political advertising by all actors. Social media platforms are to one degree or another collaborating with governments to basically identify and remove false content that is linked to foreign gray zone actors. The U.S. government has cooperated with Facebook during the 2020 election and removed a bunch of accounts tied to Russian bot farms and Iranian disinformation efforts. But if you look at other platforms, including ones I like Telegram, they won't cooperate because they're focused on user privacy. So it all depends on the modalities, terms of service, and jurisdiction of origin of the tool in question. We're also seeing economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure being used. So targeted sanctions can weaken an adversary's economy, restrict their access to global financial systems, and basically limit their ability to fund gray zone operations. And this is what we're seeing in relation to Russia as early as 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and then started interfering in American elections before it even invaded Ukraine. The American government imposed significant sanctions on Russian individuals, companies, and government leaders who were involved in these or involved in the main economic sectors like oil. This can lead to diplomatic isolation. So, for example, in 2021, the EU imposed a bevy of sanctions against Belarus because it had engaged in gray zone tactics, including that forced landing of that Ryanair flight to detain the opposition leader whose name I cannot remember right now. But basically, we're seeing a significant proliferation of gray zone activities that's also associated with proliferation of counter gray zone activities. NATO has created the Defender Europe exercises, which prepare for potential hybrid warfare scenarios, which include cyber threats, disinformation operations, particularly from Russia. So in terms of anti-access and area denial and defense preparation writ large, we're seeing a move away from purely conventional deterrence towards this asymmetric gray zone deterrence. All the while, the Western democracies are themselves beginning to use gray zone tactics. So at the end of the day, if what you need to remember here is the gray zone is the area between war and peace where states can mess with each other without fully going to war. Important historical examples, the annexation of Crimea, China engaging in maritime militia operations, Iran and North Korea using proxies, and the gray zone really matters because it empowers authoritarian regimes to take action against democratic regimes without a hell of a lot of accountability. And while there's been a global response to gray zone tactics, notably through heightened military and cyber readiness, economic and diplomatic measures, and just the construction or the building of resilience, gray zone warfare is going to continue to grow, notably through the increased use of cyber and information warfare. And as we discussed, there is no consensus definition of what is war in terms of a cyber attack. So there is a real need for international cooperation, legal and practical, in terms of determining how gray zone tactics should be responded to, how global cybersecurity coordination can be undertaken, and how the public can be educated against this information in an effective way. At the end of the day, the gray zone's reshaping global conflict and understanding the tactics that are tied to it is crucial in the interconnected world, especially as AI continues to grow. So while gray zone tactics do avoid direct confrontation, they do have a profound impact on global geopolitics, and they undermine the very foundations of global stability in the international liberal order. So as we look ahead, one thing is clear. The future of warfare might not be fought with guns or tanks, but rather with bytes and misinformation. Information and resilience is a critical line of defense. There are some great books down in the description. Hybrid Warfare by Williamson Murray, which explores kind of how it came about. The Cyber Security Dilemma by Ben Buchanan, which is a really deep, great dive into the world of cyber conflict between nations. And The Weaponization of Social Media by Emerson T. Booking. My favorite out of those, about how social media has become so critical to contemporary gray zone influence operations. Thank you so much for hanging out. My name is Kevin Dusk. I am the president of Prime Rogue Inc. It is currently 5:10 p.m. on the 14th of October, 2024 here in Calgary. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening.